A Murder of Crows by Digby Stevens, Chapter 3, Part 2. The sun was gleaming off cars, the grass and the beautiful multicoloured roses which adorned the garden area behind the church. Once more Jack was reminded of his own garden, waiting quietly for his touch. Rounding the final buttress corner, he was confronted by a large white sheet draped over the stone wall, which constituted the rear of the church building. Two police officers in uniform with high-vis vests and their heavy equipment belts were standing together talking. Each held a clipboard and were talking and making notes. The ambulance officers were setting up a gurney and checking their equipment, whilst two crime scene officers were busily taking photos and laying out markers, one outside of the taped area and one below and behind the sheet against the wall. Detective Waters approached the two young police officers. "Detective Waters, can I get a rundown on what's happening here?" As he spoke, he fished in his jacket pocket for his lanyard ID and badge, which he then looped over his neck and pinned to his lapel respectively, whilst listening to the police officers' summaries. One, a young female officer, began. "Senior Constable Salt, sir. We have a white male, age undetermined, but he is old, hanging by his feet, mutilated and murdered somewhere between 4 a.m. and 5 a.m. according to forensics." She stopped abruptly, and the young male officer continued whilst consulting his clipboard. "The body was discovered by a woman while walking her dog early this morning. She's been taken to the station to make a statement. We briefly examined the body for signs of life, isolated the scene and called for backup. We have organised site barriers for the public areas and contained the scene as much as possible to reduce contamination. We have since been coordinating the ambulance, forensics and helping cover the body, sir." Detective Waters was impressed. Two young officers who had followed procedure to the letter and were familiar with the requirements of a murder scene. "I'm very impressed, Officer Salt, and..." He paused, seeking a name tag for the young constable, but he had no badge on his vest, but rather a tear where it should have been. "Constable Finch, sir," the young man replied. My badge was torn off at an early morning call-out, disturbing the peace, and I haven't been able to replace it. We were called from there to this." Jack smiled and looked from one to the other. "Long night for you two then. You should have gone off duty a couple of hours ago, I would guess." He glanced around the scene. Another police van had arrived, and two more officers were striding toward them. The CSOs were working the area, and the ambulance drivers were waiting for clearance so they could take away the body. "I think you can both go if you are handing over to these two chaps. Leave your clipboards with me. I will ensure they're passed over. You can sign off, and good work, both of you." The two police officers nodded thanks to the detective, handed over their clipboards, and headed off in the direction of the two approaching officers. Jack made a mental note to pass on his commendations for the two young officers when he returned to the police station. However, there was a lot of work to do until then, and he pored over the two sets of clipboard notes, following the timeline of events up to that point. The sun was starting to heat up, and Jack wished he'd collected his hat from the car before he walked over. At this rate, he would need to go and get it soon, but for now he continued to read as he moved into the shade of the large stone buttresses of the south wall, out of the sun. After reading the notes, he nodded with satisfaction and approached the two replacement officers, handed them the clipboards, introduced himself and asked them to carry on while he had a look around. First in mind was the body. The CSOs had laid thick rubber mats over the garden bed below the cloth-draped corpse, obviously after photos and any testing had taken place to preserve the site as much as possible. Ducking to one side, under the large sail-like cloth, Detective Waters slid into the shade offered by the canopy. All was as it had been described to him by the young police officers. An elderly man, naked, hanging by a rope tightly bound around his ankles. The detective stepped back, drawing the heavy draped canvas with him, creating a hollow, tented effect as he backed away, opening a space before him to view the whole scene. The body hung against the back wall of the church, with its large stained glass windows, which took up half of the wall space, beginning about 3 metres above the ground. The body was held up by a heavy rope, which had somehow been thrown over the apex peak of the nave roof, with its stone crucifix peak. Behind the shoulders of the body was a piece of wood, to which the arms were lashed in a crucifix manner. The head hung straight down, wrinkled and bald, hanging from a scrawny neck, and possibly a garrote around the throat. The ligature appeared pretty tight, but was mixed with a smaller rope which held a bird, and could have been used to strangle the man. There was a large stain of now black congealed blood, which had run from the groin area down the abdomen, chest and neck, and across the face. The genitals had been removed. Most strangely, there appeared to be a dead black bird tied around the man's neck, itself hanging alongside the wrinkled face. The man's mouth was covered in a band of broad silver tape, as were the eyes. This was no casual murder. This was a well-orchestrated attack, organised and theatrically displayed by someone who had conceived every step and prepared in advance. It appeared to be some sort of ritual killing. Jack had seen some pretty gruesome murders in his time. This one was different. It was staged, and for a reason he could not yet fathom, except it must be a message to someone specific or in general. Whether the victim was killed before being hung here or after would be for the forensics and autopsy results to determine. The flesh was cold and white, and almost appeared to be marble, like a morbid statue. This was not a random or accidental killing. This had a purpose, and Jack was sure that not only the scene, but the details were significant. He felt a slight shiver down his spine, despite the warmth of the day. There was something very dark and determined about this, and Jack needed to get to the bottom of it quickly. Bowing out from under the cover, Jack returned to the spot he'd stood before, now occupied by the 2 relieving policemen, informing them that he was going to explore the site and headed over to speak to the nearest crime scene officer, who was examining an area of grass alongside the path he had travelled earlier. The woman, dressed in disposable blue paper overalls and a cap, was squatting on the ground with a camera in one of her blue latex gloved hands, examining a patch of grass. Jack waited quietly, not wanting to interrupt her train of thought, his shadow to one side of the spot she was examining, announcing his presence. Eventually she half rose and turned to speak to him. Once more he introduced himself, and she responded tersely, "Sandy Murphy, CSO." Jack asked for a brief rundown of what had occurred, knowing it would be hours before photos, evidence and some possible conclusions would be available. "We have a naked, white Caucasian male, approximately 75 years old, who's been hung in a sort of inverted crucifixion. The victim has been mutilated and bled out. Eyes and mouth are taped, and there's a dead crow hanging around his neck. The witness who alerted the police states the crow was alive at the time she discovered the body, although she thinks the man was dead." She paused. "The site has been contained, and we have taken samples and photos for evidence, but at this point we have little in the way of clues. The body would have been heavy to move as a dead weight, so the assailant would have had to have been strong to accomplish this act. No sign of drag marks, but there were signs of wheels in the grass before the sun warmed up, which we photographed. As you can see, there are still some slight indentations. The assailant may have had a pram or a cart-like vehicle to move the body." She paused, and in the same moment a light bulb went on inside Jack's head, and he blurted out the words in the same instant, "Or a shopping trolley." He turned to gaze at his car, parked in the shade under the tall pine. the trolley still parked askew against the trunk as he had first seen it. He strode toward the tree while the CSO gathered her equipment box and jogged to catch up alongside him. They paused, looking at the trolley, as if it was some wild animal tied to the tree. The CSO began to take photos, adjusting her shutter for the lower light beneath the tree. Jack paced slowly around, looking at the tree and the ground, as if stalking the silver contraption, now a possible accomplice in a murder investigation. After a circuit, he paused and spoke to Sandy. "I assume you will be looking for fingerprints and any footprints, etc." She nodded. "I'll leave it to you," Jack replied. "Is it okay to walk around the area as yet?" Sandy nodded. "Yes, we've done a sweep and taken photos, so if you want to see if we missed anything, be my guest." She smiled without a hint of sarcasm. Jack smiled in reply. "Keep up the good work, and thanks." Opening the car, he removed his hat from the rear seat and turned back towards the busy group around the draped corpse. Approaching, he observed the ambulance crew, removing the timber tied to the arms, in readiness for moving the body onto the gurney and transportation to the hospital morgue. Again he paused and looked around. Which direction would the trolley have been wheeled in from? Had it been heard? There were 2 gates into the church grounds, one on the east side and one on the west. The east was the front gate and consisted of a large double gate for vehicle entry and a smaller pedestrian gate beside it. However, the larger gate was generally kept locked. Still, a trolley could enter through that smaller gate. The back gate he had entered by was another large double gate, and this was almost always open. This was the utility gate and used for most general purposes. A trolley entering the front gate would have been rattling along as they do, although less so with a body weighing it down, but it did not pass by anything but the church and the back hall, which was used for functions and conferences. Entering the back gate meant that you would pass the presbytery, and if there was a rattle it could be heard. If so, this could establish a time. At this point, he couldn't think of anything that wouldn't be answered by the CSOs. He still had his old copper nose itching to look around. Avoiding the immediate crime scene, he began to wander the gardens, his eyes as keen as a magpie, seeking anything which might be out of place. Again, he noted the gardens were well kept, lots of lawn with beds of roses in bloom, all well cared for. He personally didn't really care for roses himself. They tended to be straggly, and if not pruned constantly, the flowers were brief and then looked ragged as they decayed, and they had thorns, which he didn't care much for either. Still, at this moment, they looked glorious, and the beauty wasn't lost on him. The grass appeared to have been mown recently. Dry tufts of clippings still littered the lawns and hadn't yet blown away or decayed. There was no evidence of footprints on any of the soil beds, and the cut lawn edgings had not been broken down by heavy feet or dragging. In fact, the garden appeared undisturbed. After a walk around the beds in the front garden of the church on the roadside, between the temporary screens and the church building, he found himself back at the ambulance and the pine tree shading his car. His gaze swept the old red brick hall beside the church. Like all of the buildings, except the cathedral itself, which was a massive bluestone structure, the bulk of the hall must have been the equivalent of a 4-story building and edged the parking area with its size. Behind that, he could see the presbytery with its side door for the priests to make a short walk to the church for Mass. Itself, another large, imposing building, also built in red brick. This was a little more ornate than the hall, with painted yellow stone embellishments and a covered balcony featuring balustrades. As his gaze swept down from the blue sky to the slate roof and red brick walls, he caught sight of a movement in a window. A curtain closed abruptly, as if the viewer had spotted him and didn't want to be seen. Curious, Jack walked over to the rear door of the presbytery and knocked 3 times before it was finally opened by a small lady about 60 years old or more with red curly hair and a wrinkled face. After a brief introduction, Detective Waters began a gentle cross-examination of the lady. Did she reside in the building? Had she seen it or heard anything? And who else was in the building? The little lady fidgeted with the hem of an old faded apron she was wearing. She was obviously hard of hearing because she kept cupping her ear as Jack spoke. Finally, she replied, stating that she resided in the back of the building and was a housekeeper for the priests who lived there. No, she hadn't heard anything, but her hearing wasn't good, and no, there was nobody else in the building at the moment. The priests were all out ministering to the elderly or on their day off. Jack asked for her name, writing Dolly Patterson in his book. This was going nowhere, and he concluded by asking if he'd be able to return at a later date to speak to the priests. Dolly found a business card and suggested he ring the building secretary to make arrangements. Thanking her curtly, Jack turned and made his way back to the crime scene, adding extra notes in the small pocket notebook as he walked. His radar twitched at the back of his mind, and he turned around to look again at the building, in time to see the same curtain being closed. The housekeeper would not have reached what he estimated to be the second floor that quickly, and he paused to look and observe. But the curtain did not move again. Torn between a desire to storm back and ask to speak to whoever was in the house and a need to complete his fact-finding here, he decided he would return later in the day and continued on. The mobile phone buzzed in his pocket, the text reading, "Meeting 9 a.m, DCI Tillotson office, confirm." He nodded to himself. This would be the overview, and started the investigation, meeting with his superior and probably others, forming a team and mapping out tasks. Not exactly how he had planned his day. He typed confirm and sent the text. Glancing at his watch, it was 8:30. No time to run the girls to netball, and he would have to get back to the station, only 5 minutes away. But he couldn't be late. Meeting the Detective Chief Inspector. He quickly rang Sarah and explained that he had a murder case on his hands and he was sorry he wouldn't be able to drop the girls at netball. Sarah knew the way these things went. A murder would mean she wouldn't see much of Jack for a while. The old maxim, the first 48 hours are crucial, still held true. She had heard it so many times. He apologised and hung up, smiling at how ironic it was phoning when the shop itself was less than 100 yards away on the other side of the main street. Sarah would already be there, and his daughters waiting for him. She would have to ask Leanne, who worked Saturdays, helping on a usually busy day, to mind the coffee shop while she dropped off and later picked up the girls. Jack began a direct walk towards the large pine tree and his car. The ambulance was gone, and the two CSOs were packing their bags and loading items from the scene into the back of a police van. The large piece of timber used to create a crucifixion effect protruded from the rear door of the vehicle as they rolled up their canvas tarp and stowed it also in the vehicle. The two relieving police officers had removed their vests and were dismantling the sight screens, labouring under a now hot sun. The garden wasn't sparkling anymore. It was simply green and hushed in the heat of the day. He estimated it was probably about 25 degrees, and it was going to be a lovely warm day. He was hoping for a long, drawn-out autumn. Heaven knows the winters were long enough, and he would be confined to the house or his shed on the weekends, and he loved to be outside. Still, we take what they send us, he thought. Back at his car, he noted the shopping trolley had been moved to the other side of the tree in an open space, but behind the presbytery. Undoubtedly, Sandy Murphy had dusted and photographed it to the point it was no longer required. How long before some citizen will walk it back to the supermarket? The handle said Aldi, and the nearest store was over 1 kilometre away. Lazy people, he thought, as he opened the car door and climbed in for the short drive to the station.